aircraft miles away from the wreckage. So my idea was to get as much information or collect as much artifacts or physical evidence as I could.
Right from the start, the investigation team is at a disadvantage. They discover that there's no cockpit voice recorder or flight data recorder on the plane. What's standard for passenger jets is not required in the Air Force.
I had assumed that the Air Force and these VIP flights had higher safety standards than commercial flights. And so I was really shocked to learn that the standards were generally lower than those for commercial aviation.
Without the standard tools, investigators can't afford to overlook anything. The wreck is almost 3 kilometers from the airport. How did a trained crew get so far off course? As Swansea examines the wreckage, Nelson Spornheimer is brought in to look at other evidence. An expert in aerial navigation, he plots the plane's doomed final minutes. To trace the last moments of the flight, he turns to the sky and the US Air Force radar plane, which had been patrolling the region.
IFO-21, this is Magic 5-1. Be advised, you're leaving an approved corridor. Please reroute immediately.
Rerouting now to proper corridor. Over.
Apart from heading out of approved airspace, Spornheimer finds nothing unusual about the plane's flight until the end.
The radar track that I was given was from an AWACS aircraft and showed that the en route portions of the flight from about 100 miles prior to the airport were entirely nominal.
The last segment of the flight, however, beginning 20 kilometers from the airport, is different. On their final approach, the plane begins to head off course. They start flying in a straight line, which heads right into the mountains.
My initial look at the flight track of the aircraft showed a 7-degree bearing error in the final segment of the approach.
A small error when traveling at hundreds of kilometers an hour could quickly lead to an enormous problem. But why would the plane get off course at the end of the trip if the rest of the flight showed no major navigational problems? Even in bad weather, how had the crew become so lost? Spornheimer examines the outdated navigational equipment at the airport. Badly damaged during the recent war, perhaps it had malfunctioned. 2 separate navigational beacons are used for landing in Dubrovnik. One guides planes to the runway, the other lets them know if they've gone too far. The first is located on nearby Kolosep Island. It transmits a specific Morse code signal to make it easily identifiable. When they hear it, all Davis and his crew need to do is fly a heading specified on their landing charts. If they do, they should eventually arrive at the airport. The second beacon is located at the airport itself. It's a fail-safe device. If the crew hears the beacon before they see the airport, they have to declare a missed approach and circle around to try landing again. In fact, the plane that brought Peter Galbraith to Dubrovnik just minutes before IFO-21 only landed on its second attempt.
IFO-21, I read you, 9ACRO, over.
Adjusting diverting to
split if you have to execute the missed approach.
Over.
Roger, 9ACRO, we read you. Out.
But after studying the equipment, Spornheimer doesn't believe it played a role in the crash.
Both the non-directional beacons were found to be operating normally by flight tests within a few days after the accident.
There are bizarre rumors of an even more sinister theory. Perhaps Davis was following a decoy beacon put in the mountains on purpose. In a troubled region, Was this an attack on the trade mission?
To get a signal that is strong enough to be heard, you have to have a very large ground system, which is difficult to establish in rocky, sandy soil. So it would be very expensive and very time-consuming to set up an NDB in the mountains.
Such an elaborate scheme would be nearly impossible to pull off. No evidence is ever found of a decoy beacon. The investigation continues. In the wreckage of the Air Force flight, investigators discover an important piece of the puzzle. The plane's ADF, or automatic direction finder, is recovered. It appears to be working, but only one of the units had been installed on this jet. To perform a proper landing in Dubrovnik, a plane requires 2 ADFs. The device listens to the signals put out by the land-based beacons, but it can only listen to one at a time.
We're still not past it. I'm tuned back to KLP.
Flying with one ADF, the crew can listen to either the beacon which is telling them how to get to the airport, or the beacon which is telling them they've gone too far. They can't do both at the same time.
That would have required 2 ADF receivers in the aircraft, which the accident aircraft had only one. And only having one ADF restricted their ability to follow the approach accurately.
I got CV. We're still not past it. I'm tuning back to KLP.
By quickly tuning back and forth between the 2 beacons, the crew can use one ADF to listen to 2 signals. But it would have added stress to an already difficult landing. And it's another surprise. The Air Force jet wasn't adequately equipped to land at this airport.
You're talking in a very short time span of making the approach. It's going to become rather difficult in trying to dial both to keep listening to the code if you're also trying to search for your course and headings.
As he continues to study the path that IFO 21 took, Nelson Spornheimer focuses on an S-shaped curve in the plane's flight. It's the sort of path a plane would take when looking for a signal from a non-directional beacon. But just when the crew should be looking for the beacon signal, the S-turns disappear.
At about 2 or 3 miles inside the final approach fix, for the next 7 or 8, 9 miles, the flight track is perfectly straight.
Instead of trusting the navigational system that was in place, even though it was primitive, the crew suddenly seems to give up. And Spornheimer thinks he knows why. Fighting heavy rain and hampered by a single direction finder, Spornheimer believes the crew resorted to another, even older piece of technology to find the runway, something called INS, or Inertial Navigation System.
An INS system uses gyroscopes to maintain an awareness of how much the airplane turns and banks.
After entering a specific geographical position at the beginning of a flight, an inertial navigation system tracks all the turns a plane makes. It's a self-contained system on the aircraft. But there is a potentially enormous problem. If the gyroscopes don't perfectly calculate every single maneuver of the plane, a pilot can be off course.
It's not very broken up down there. I can't see through it. Tim?
The crew might have thought that switching to this system would help them find their way. But in this case, it might have put the plane dangerously off course.
INS drift in this case was probably, in my view, the primary reason the aircraft ended up where it was.
Investigator Howard Swansea examines the Jeppson approach chart the crew was using as they attempted to land. Hampered by poor visibility and relying on the inertial navigation system, their charts would have been a key aid. But when he takes a closer look at it, he notices something peculiar. A key figure, the minimum descent altitude, isn't accurate. The minimum descent altitude is the height where pilots must be able to see the airport. If you can't see it at that height, you have to abort the landing.
Each country has the responsibility of developing these procedures and then publishing information so that other nationalities as well as their own air crews can fly those approach procedures.
Swansea discovers that the minimum descent altitude on the chart doesn't meet American aviation standards. Given the mountainous terrain, it should have been more than 2,800 feet. But the chart the crew was using said it was just over 2,100 feet. It means that the crew could have flown almost 700 feet lower than experts in the US thought was safe without having to abort the landing. Combined with the other problems the crew was dealing with, the non-standard chart sealed their fate. Struggling to find the airport, they were straining to see through the clouds, assuming they were still safely above the mountains. But why wasn't an Air Force jet properly equipped to land in Dubrovnik? And why didn't the crew have the right landing charts that would have made even a difficult flight safer?